On the morning of December 19, 1944, the cold inside a converted French army barracks in Verdun felt sharper than the winter outside. The room was crowded with senior Allied commanders, men whose decisions moved armies and reshaped continents. Yet none of them appeared confident. Their faces were rigid, their posture tense. Maps covered the table before them, marked with thick arrows that showed enemy advances, cutting deep into territory that only days earlier had been considered secure. The war had suddenly changed direction, and every man in the room understood that they were facing a crisis unlike anything they had anticipated. Only 3 days earlier, more than 200,000 German soldiers had erupted through American lines in the Ardennes forest. The attack struck with overwhelming violence. Artillery fire tore into positions that had been lightly defended, chosen precisely because Allied planners believed the terrain made a large-scale offensive impossible. Infantry followed the bombardment in dense formations, advancing through fog and snow. Armored columns pushed forward along narrow roads that Allied intelligence had dismissed as unsuitable for tanks in winter. American units that had been resting or holding extended frontages were hit without warning. Some were surrounded within hours. Others were crushed so quickly that they ceased to exist as organized formations. Communication lines failed almost immediately. Commanders lost contact with their battalions. What had been assumed to be a quiet sector dissolved into chaos. At the head of the table sat Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. He had seen reversals before, but this one carried a unique danger. Reports arriving from the front painted a grim picture. Entire American divisions were falling back in disarray. Refugees clogged the roads. German spearheads were driving westward with alarming speed. One name appeared repeatedly in every intelligence summary and situation report: Bastogne. The small Belgian town sat at the center of a critical road network. If German forces captured it, they could move rapidly toward the Meuse River and beyond. They could split the Allied armies in two and threaten the ports that sustained the Allied advance. If that happened, the entire Western Front could collapse. Eisenhower looked around the table and asked the question that defined the moment. How soon, he asked, could someone attack north and relieve Bastogne? The room fell into a heavy silence. Generals leaned forward, studying maps and tracing routes with gloved fingers. Their minds raced through calculations: distances, fuel requirements, ammunition stocks, the state of roads buried under snow and ice, units already engaged in combat that would have to disengage without collapsing. Turning an army was not like turning a battalion. It required coordination across thousands of vehicles, supply depots, artillery units, and command posts. Under ideal conditions, such a maneuver took weeks. Under these conditions, it seemed impossible. Then George Smith Patton spoke. He said he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours. Several heads turned sharply. Some officers stared at him in disbelief. Others assumed he was exaggerating, speaking from instinct rather than calculation. Patton had a reputation for bold statements and aggressive promises. But this claim went beyond boldness. To disengage multiple divisions from active combat, rotate an entire army 90 degrees, move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through snow and ice, and then launch a coordinated assault against hardened German positions within 48 hours defied every accepted rule of operational planning. Every experienced commander in the room understood that what Patton was proposing was operationally impossible. But Patton was not bluffing. He was not improvising. He was the only man in that room who had seen the attack coming and had been preparing for it long before the first German shell landed. 10 days earlier, on December 9, 1944, Patton had been at his headquarters in Nancy, France. The broader Allied advance continued across Western Europe, and most commanders believed the war was entering its final phase. German resistance appeared fragmented. Supply shortages plagued the enemy. Optimism dominated Allied planning. But within Third Army headquarters, a very different assessment was taking shape. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's chief intelligence officer, entered his commander's office carrying a stack of reports that weighed heavily on his mind. Koch was meticulous by nature, known for his attention to detail and his refusal to accept convenient explanations. For weeks, he had been tracking German unit movements across the Western Front. He compared reconnaissance reports, intercepted radio traffic, prisoner interrogations, and civilian accounts. Gradually, a pattern emerged that deeply concerned him. 15 German divisions had disappeared. These were not depleted remnants or small formations. They were full-strength divisions, including several panzer units equipped with hundreds of tanks. Entire formations had been pulled off the line and moved somewhere else. Yet Allied intelligence could not account for their location. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force offered an explanation. The Germans, it was believed, were holding these divisions in reserve to respond to Allied breakthroughs. It was a defensive posture. There was nothing to worry about. Koch did not accept that conclusion. He had studied German operational behavior for months. The Wehrmacht did not concentrate 15 divisions simply to react. That amount of combat power represented offensive intent. It was sufficient to launch a major counteroffensive. Koch spread his maps across Patton's desk and pointed to the Ardennes forest. American divisions were thinly spread there, holding frontages that should have required 3 times as many troops. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested. Roads were narrow and difficult to navigate, especially in winter. That was precisely why most Allied commanders dismissed the Ardennes as a likely avenue of attack. Koch reminded Patton of history. In 1940, German forces had attacked through the same forest and reached the English Channel in a matter of weeks, conquering France. Difficulty had not deterred them then, and there was no reason to believe it would deter them now. Surprise and speed were central to German doctrine. Koch presented additional evidence. German radio traffic in the Ardennes sector had increased dramatically. Prisoner interrogations mentioned unfamiliar units arriving under cover of darkness. Civilians reported unusual activity behind German lines. Each indicator alone might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a coherent picture. Patton listened carefully, studying the maps without interruption. When Koch finished, Patton asked a single, direct question. "If you are right, when does the attack come?" Koch did not hesitate. Within the next 2 weeks. Patton immediately contacted his superior, General Omar Bradley, and laid out Koch's analysis. Bradley listened but remained unconvinced. Supreme Headquarters intelligence disagreed with Koch's conclusions. Germany, Bradley believed, lacked the strength for a major offensive. The war was almost over. Patton was advised not to worry. After the call ended, Patton remained silent for a long moment. Then he turned back to Koch and issued a simple order. Begin planning. Over the next 10 days, Third Army Headquarters worked quietly and deliberately. 3 complete contingency plans were developed to respond to a German offensive in the Ardennes. Each plan was detailed down to the minute. Truck routes were calculated. Fuel supplies were pre-positioned. Artillery batteries were assigned alternate firing positions. Infantry divisions were given specific assembly areas and movement schedules. Every variable was considered. If the enemy attacked from one direction, one plan would be activated. If circumstances changed, another plan would replace it instantly. Many officers believed Patton was overreacting. Third Army was engaged in offensive operations toward Germany. Why plan for a defensive crisis more than 100 miles to the north? Because Patton trusted his intelligence officer more than comforting assumptions. On December 12th, Patton met with his senior commanders and instructed them to be ready to disengage on short notice. He offered no explanation. The order made little sense, but Patton's subordinates were professionals. They followed it. By December 15th, Third Army stood alone among major Allied formations. It was the only force with fully developed contingency plans for the Ardennes. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions. Infantry followed, then tanks. 3 German armies surged forward with overwhelming force, outnumbering American defenders nearly 4-1. Units that had been resting were suddenly fighting for survival. At Supreme Headquarters, early reports were dismissed as local counterattacks. It took hours for the true scale of the disaster to become clear. Entire American units were collapsing. The 106th Infantry Division was virtually destroyed. 2 of its regiments surrendered, marking the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. At Third Army headquarters, there was no disbelief. Patton summoned his staff and turned to Koch. "You were right," he said. "What are they after?" Koch studied the incoming reports and answered without hesitation. "Bastogne." From there, Antwerp. Patton nodded and gave the order to execute the contingency plans. While other Allied headquarters struggled to understand what was happening, Third Army began disengaging from its eastward offensive. Patton had not been surprised. He had been ready. The moment Patton gave the order to activate the contingency plans, Third Army shifted from anticipation to action. While other Allied headquarters were still struggling to understand the scale of the German assault, Patton's command moved with calm precision. Units that had been driving east only hours earlier began preparing to pivot north. Staff officers pulled out maps that had already been marked and rehearsed. Routes were confirmed, fuel allocations adjusted, and artillery units notified of new firing zones. There was no debate, no hesitation. Everything that was happening had been imagined, planned, and timed days in advance. As reports continued to arrive from the Ardennes, the contrast between Third Army and other commands became stark. At Supreme Headquarters, confusion dominated the early hours of the German offensive. Initial intelligence summaries described the attack as a limited counterstroke. Some believed it was merely an attempt to slow the Allied advance. Only gradually did the truth emerge. German forces were advancing along a broad front. American divisions were being overrun. Roads were clogged with retreating units and refugees. The scale of the disaster could no longer be denied. At General Omar Bradley's headquarters, disbelief gave way to urgency. Allied intelligence had repeatedly assured commanders that Germany lacked the strength for a major offensive. The idea that 3 German armies could strike with such coordination seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in the Ardennes and assigned what was supposed to be a quiet sector, had been shattered. 2 of its regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater, and it sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure. At Third Army headquarters, the reaction was entirely different. Patton summoned his senior staff and listened carefully as Oscar Koch laid out the developing picture. German armored thrusts were converging toward a single objective: Bastogne. Control of that road junction would allow German forces to move westward rapidly. From there, Antwerp lay within reach. Patton did not question the assessment. He accepted it immediately. He ordered General Hugh Gaffey to ready the 4th Armored Division for immediate movement and instructed other divisions to prepare to follow. As 3rd Army began disengaging from offensive operations in the Saar region, the scale of what Patton was attempting became clear. This was not a simple redeployment. Entire divisions had to be extracted from contact with the enemy, reorganized, and redirected across snow-covered terrain. Supply lines that had been flowing east toward Germany now had to be turned north. Fuel depots were reassigned. Ammunition priorities changed overnight. Artillery units prepared to support a completely different axis of advance. On December 19, 1944, Eisenhower convened the emergency meeting at Verdun. Senior commanders from across the theater gathered in the cold barracks, each carrying grim reports from their sectors. The German breakthrough had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. Bastogne was surrounded. Weather conditions grounded Allied aircraft, removing one of the Allies' greatest advantages. Roads were jammed, communications strained, and units scattered. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a statement that surprised many present. He declared that the situation should be viewed as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. The German army had committed its reserves. It had left its defensive positions and exposed itself. If the Allies could respond quickly enough, they could destroy Germany's remaining offensive strength in the West. The logic was sound, but the practical challenge was immense. When Eisenhower asked how soon someone could attack north to relieve Bastogne, the silence that followed reflected the difficulty of the task. Commanders studied their maps and calculated distances, supply requirements, and movement timelines. Some suggested a week. Others estimated 10 days or more. No one believed a rapid response was possible under such conditions. Then Patton spoke. He stated calmly that he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours and with 3 divisions within 72. The room went silent. Patton was known for boldness, but this claim seemed beyond even his reputation. Eisenhower challenged him directly. This was no time for bravado. The 101st Airborne was surrounded. If relief was promised and failed to arrive, thousands of men would die. Patton did not waver. He told Eisenhower that the orders had already been issued. 3rd Army was disengaging even as they spoke. He had been expecting the German attack for 11 days. The revelation stunned the room. How could Patton have anticipated an offensive that had caught Supreme Headquarters by surprise? Eisenhower studied him carefully. He had known Patton for decades. He knew when Patton was exaggerating and when he was speaking with complete confidence. This time, Patton was not bluffing. Eisenhower made his decision. He authorized Patton to move immediately. Patton left the meeting and made a single phone call to his Chief of Staff at 3rd Army Headquarters. The message was brief and unmistakable. Play ball. Those 2 words set the entire machine in motion. Within minutes, orders flowed through 3rd Army's communications network. The 4th Armored Division began moving north. The 26th Infantry Division followed. Other units prepared to disengage and redeploy, according to the contingency plans. Truck convoys that had been quietly pre-positioned days earlier began loading troops and equipment. Artillery batteries displaced from firing positions and moved toward new assignments. Supply depots shifted from supporting eastward offensive operations to sustaining a relief attack toward Bastogne. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and medical units were rerouted without delay. What followed was one of the most complex troop movements of the war. More than 100,000 men and over 130,000 vehicles began moving across snow-covered roads and narrow village lanes. Supply lines that had flowed east were redirected north. Units that had been in combat that morning would be in combat again more than 100 miles away within days. The weather was brutal. Snow and ice covered the roads. Engines failed. Men suffered frostbite. Vehicles broke down and were pushed aside to keep traffic moving. Other Allied armies watched in disbelief as reports came in. While they were still reorganizing and attempting to stabilize their sectors, Third Army was already executing a counterattack. This was not improvisation or luck. Every route had been planned. Every contingency had been considered. Every supply cache had been positioned in advance. Patton was not performing a miracle. He was executing preparation. By the time the movement reached full momentum, the outcome was no longer a question of whether Third Army would attack, but how quickly it would arrive. The answer, as Patton had promised, would soon redefine what Allied commanders believed was possible. As Third Army surged northward, the sheer scale of the movement became visible across the frozen countryside. Columns of trucks stretched for miles, their engines growling through snow and ice as they followed routes that had been calculated long before the first German shell fell. Military police stood at crossroads day and night, directing traffic and clearing breakdowns with ruthless efficiency. Vehicles that could not move were pushed aside without hesitation. There was no time to stop. Every hour mattered. Men slept in their vehicles, ate cold rations on the move, and pressed forward through exhaustion because the mission allowed no delay. The weather was relentless. Snowstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing. Ice coated roads and turned minor errors into deadly accidents. Engines froze, fuel lines clogged, and weapons had to be constantly cleaned to keep them functional. Frostbite cases increased as temperatures dropped well below freezing. Yet the movement continued without pause. Third Army did not slow because slowing meant failure. Patton demanded momentum, and his commanders delivered it, knowing that speed was the only advantage they had. By December 21, 1944, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached their assigned positions after covering more than 100 miles in less than 2 days. They arrived ready to fight. There was no rest, no time to reorganize. On December 22nd, Third Army launched its attack toward Bastogne. German forces had anticipated resistance, but not at this scale and not at this speed. Defensive positions had been prepared along every approach. Villages were fortified. Forests were turned into killing zones. Every mile was contested as American tanks and infantry fought their way forward through snow-covered fields and narrow roads. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne endured the final days of encirclement. Ammunition was critically low. Food was rationed to the bare minimum. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and wounded men lay in freezing buildings with little more than blankets for warmth. When German commanders demanded surrender, believing resistance was futile, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous one-word reply: nuts. The defenders held because they believed relief was coming, even as the sound of fighting echoed in the distance. On the afternoon of December 26, 1944, the gamble paid off. The lead tank of the 4th Armored Division, known as Cobra King, broke through the final German positions near the village of Eisenhower. At 4:50 in the afternoon, contact was made with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was finally broken. Supply convoys moved in that very night, bringing ammunition, food, and medical aid. The paratroopers who had held out for 8 days against overwhelming odds now had the support they needed to continue the fight, and the course of the Battle of the Bulge was permanently changed.